Hello. Thank you for joining the ERJ Podcast. My name is Dr. Don Sin. I'm the Deputy Chief Editor of the European Respiratory Journal. Today I'm joined by Dr. Yet Khor to discuss her latest paper entitled Generalisability of Pharmaceutical Randomized Controlled Trial Eligibility Criteria for Progressive Pulmonary Fibrosis. Dr. Khor is an Associate Professor at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Khor is an international leader in interstitial lung disease research and is an Associate Editor of the ERJ. Hello, Yet. Many thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Don. Thanks for having me.
Could you provide a brief summary of your study and its main findings?
So, progressive pulmonary fibrosis, or PPF, is really an emerging entity in the field of interstitial lung disease over the last few years and has gained a lot of attention with a rising number of pharmaceutical randomized control trials to look for the next effective treatment. And I think this study will aim to understand how well clinical trial populations actually reflect the patients that we see in clinical practice. And we can divide this paper into two parts. The first aim is to evaluate the eligibility criteria for PPF randomized control trial that's currently completed or in progress. And second, we assess the application of this common clinical trial eligibility criteria in real-world patients in terms of how many patients will meet the criteria to participate and whether there's any differences in the change of lung function and mortality according to the trial eligibility for participating in clinical trials. And to do this, we've pretty much applied the common eligibility criteria to patients from the prospective multicenter Canadian Registry for Pulmonary Fibrosis to look at the real-world patients. And given there's still debate about what is the best definitions for PPF, we decided to look into two common ones. The first one that we decided, which we term as trial PPF, that's the criteria that's used most commonly across the different clinical trials, and that was first introduced by the inbuilt trial of nintedanib back in 2019. Then we look at the second definition for PPF based on the international guidelines that was published back in 2022, which we term as the guideline PPF. So I think there are a few interesting kind of take-home findings from this study. So of the 16 in progress or completed randomized control trial that we identified, there were 10 different definitions of PPF that were used across them. And there were more than 50 different eligibility criteria. Over 2/3 of them have at least 20 or more eligibility criteria in order to participate in the clinical trials. And there were 11 common ones that was applied in most of the majority of the trials. For instance, which is not unexpected, exclusion of people with more severe lung disease, more advanced stage, but also exclusion of people with selected comorbidities. For instance, cardiac disease, which is rather common in this group of patients. So when we apply this common eligibility criteria to our patients, either using the trial PPF definitions or the guideline PPF definitions, only about 50% of patients will be eligible to participate in clinical trials. That's quite astonishing. Then if we look at how do they differ, those who are eligible to participate versus those who didn't. So for patients who are eligible to participate in the clinical trial, where we use the PPF definitions from the guideline on the clinical trials, they consistently have more rapid decline in their lung function, but they have lower mortality compared to those who are non-eligible for the clinical trials. So I think it's quite important to note that there's difference between patients who do eligible and not eligible when we treat them in the clinical practice.
Very good. Maybe for the audience, can you define what you mean by progressive pulmonary fibrosis? Is this a clinical entity?
It is a clinical entity that applies to people with fibrotic interstitial lung disease who don't have a diagnosis of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So it's kind of a basket of a mixed bag of non-IPF fibrotic interstitial lung disease. And this group of patients characterized by kind of progressive decline in their performance, either measured using lung function, radiology, or clinical symptoms. So they kind of behave like IPF, but they don't have IPF. They could be attributed to like connective tissue disease from rheumatoid arthritis or hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So it's not a unique diagnosis because you still have to diagnose the underlying ILD, but they kind of behave in the same way.
And you mentioned that the trial eligible patients had faster FVC or forced vital capacity decline, but better transplant-free survival. These two things, at least on the surface, seem contradictory. How do you reconcile these findings?
Yeah, definitely. At the first glance, it seems conflicting when your patient is declining more, but they are kind of less likely to disease or receive a lung transplant. And I think this is attributed to the kind of earlier disease stage of the patients who are eligible for the clinical trials. They tend to have more preserved lung function. And in some way, it's actually easier to demonstrate a decline, to detect the change, compared to those who have more advanced disease who aren't eligible for clinical trials. They typically have lower lung volume, where with the flow effect, it's very hard to detect further change, which can be quite small, even though individual patient that might still be very important.
I see. Simply, the trial eligible patients had better lung function coming into the study.
Yes,
And therefore, there is more to lose
definitely.
in terms of lung function. Okay, that makes sense. Can you tell us a little bit about the current therapeutic landscape of progressive pulmonary fibrosis, or maybe even for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis?
There's no doubt that nintedanib and pirfenidone form the basis of disease-targeted therapies for this two group of patients, IPF and PPF. But I think in clinical practice, we often extrapolate outside of patients who are eligible for clinical trials. We can prescribe these medications to people who actually don't meet the criteria to participate in those pivotal trials, where it's reported to slow down lung function decline by about 50%. And I think the effects that we learned about this medication from those pivotal trials may not be relevant for this group of patients who aren't eligible, as kind of shown in our studies. And in clinical practice, it's very important to take that into consideration when prescribing outside of the kind of trial eligibility criteria for these medications, especially in the discussion with the patient, what is the expected treatment effects and potential side effects that this patient may be facing, which seems to be a bit higher than those who participated in the clinical trials.
And it's quite astonishing, as you say, that maybe 50%, maybe even 60% of patients with PPF or progressive pulmonary fibrosis have not been included or been excluded or do not fit into the clinical trial eligibility criteria. So do you think the findings of the clinical trials can be applied to that 50%, or should all the clinical trial data be ignored for that 50% who are not eligible?
I think paying attention to the key eligible and exclusion criteria is going to be very important in considering to what extent can we extrapolate to this. I think the underlying pathophysiology or the biomechanisms of how the IPF and PPF is going to be similar across different disease severity, but patients' profile in terms of the age, the comorbidities profiles is going to influence the degree of benefits the patient is going to get from the medications and the potential side effects that they may suffer from taking the medications.
Do you think in the future for therapeutic trials, the eligibility criteria should be modified to be more inclusive than exclusive? And if so, what would these clinical trials look like?
I think definitely there are kind of scope for us to broaden the eligibility criteria. I think looking at the eligibility criteria when we're assessing those included studies, sometimes you can say that from the first study to the next few studies, there's something about copy and pasting. You want to mirror the first study, which is successful, but the potential pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics of the individual drugs are different. I think you need to take each individual trial different, consider the different criteria, especially, I think, exclusion of comorbidities, because this is a group of patients where multimorbidity is very common. Let's say exclusion of cardiac disease, they will pretty much rule out a lot of patients to participate in clinical trials, unless there's really compelling kind of justification why that medications can impact of cardiac disease based on the pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics. That should not be kind of just carry on as a standard common eligibility criteria for the next clinical trial. I think that's important to consider these clinical trials and to broaden it to capture more patients I think one of the potential approach or a kind of step forward, if there are still concerns about the heterogeneity of patients that's going to be enrolled into the clinical trials introducing confounders, is to consider stratified enrollment and stratified analysis while we allowed more patients to participate, but we also account for that statistically in the methodology, or consideration of using more adaptive trial designs where you can perform interim analysis to try to expand or restrict based on what was found.
It's unlikely that pharmaceutical companies will do that. They will exclude people, who don't meet their inclusion criteria. So do you think regulatory agencies should mandate a more inclusive inclusion and exclusion criteria for PPF trials in the future?
I think that's definitely the way to move forward. I think to have a roundtable including industrial partners, the clinicians, the patient representatives, and more importantly, the regulatory bodies, who is kind of the final decision maker. Because I think currently we are excluding a lot of patients where the medications that get to the market actually doesn't apply to them. After putting in all the effort and the investments in uptime, not just from clinicians, but also from the patients themselves. And it would be good to have medication that have a high external validity to different populations and not just those who participate in the clinical trials.
Very good. I think that's a very important comment. Any last words on your study or on the topic of PPF in general?
I think we are really in the very exciting time in the field of fibrotic ILD at the moment, where there's a lot of interest to discover new medications and also to establish evidence for existing medications that we are already using, but not knowing how good they are. But I think the next challenge for us is to try to push the field forward to think more laterally, change our thinking with the incorporation, apart from broadening eligibility criteria, but also thinking about more innovative trials, engaging the regulatory bodies, our pharmaceutical industry. I think it's also time to think about whether FVC is the real gold standard clinical trial endpoints for IPF, whether that really is the ultimate meaningful endpoints that we are targeting at.
Well, thank you, Yet, for very insightful comments on not only your study, but on the field of progressive pulmonary fibrosis. And thank you, the audience, for joining us today. Dr. Khor's paper, Generalisability of Pharmaceutical Randomized Controlled Trial, Eligibility Criteria for Progressive Pulmonary Fibrosis, is now available on the ERJ website.